History remembers William Wallace as a symbol of rebellion and freedom. But few know the real story of how he died, alone, dismembered, and ultimately human. When we think of William Wallace, we imagine the roaring warrior from Braveheart, painted face, great sword in hand, defiant to his last breath. A man who stood against the crushing weight of English tyranny. A patriot. A martyr. A legend. But legends have a way of softening the truth. Wallace's name echoes through the centuries as a beacon of resistance. His victories, his leadership, his unbreakable spirit, they've all been etched into the cultural memory of Scotland and beyond. Yet behind the myth lies a man. And that man suffered. Not in glorious battle, but in chains. Not with an army by his side, but alone, paraded through hostile streets. His death was not swift. It was not honorable. It was calculated cruelty, designed to erase his legacy by making a spectacle of his body. What was done to Wallace in August of 1305 was not merely an execution, it was a message. And that message was written in steel, fire, rope, and blood. In this video, we're going to peel back the romanticized veneer and confront the real end of William Wallace. It's darker than the movies tell you. More gruesome than legend dares to describe. And it forces us to ask, what does it really cost to become a symbol? Wallace's final battle did not take place on a battlefield, but within his own body. After the crushing defeat at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, William Wallace disappeared from the main stage of war. He resigned his guardianship of Scotland and faded into the shadows of resistance. But he never surrendered. He continued to rally support, coordinate uprisings, and resist Edward I's relentless campaign to dominate Scotland. For years, Wallace remained a phantom, unseen but always feared. But in the summer of 1305, that changed. Wallace was betrayed. The details are murky, but most accounts point to a Scottish knight named John de Menteith, once an ally, who handed him over to the English near Glasgow. Whether for money, favor, or fear, the result was the same: Wallace was captured, chained, and transported to London. It was not a soldier's capture. It was a trophy hunt. And Wallace was the prize. He arrived in London in August 1305, dragged through the streets to the Tower. The people jeered. Children threw stones. Some had never seen a Scotsman before, much less one so infamous. But Wallace had already begun to break, not physically, not yet, but politically and spiritually. He was isolated from his homeland, cut off from any loyal voices, mocked and reviled in the enemy capital. His crimes were already written, his verdict predetermined. And worst of all, the king who had ordered his death, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, would not even grant him a warrior's end. There would be no sword, no clean beheading. The punishment was treason. And for that, the sentence was hanging, drawing, and quartering. It was the most severe punishment known in English law. And it had a purpose: to obliterate. Wallace's trial was a formality. Held at Westminster Hall on August 23, it lasted mere hours. He was denied counsel. He was not allowed to speak freely. His defense, that he was not a subject of the English crown and therefore not guilty of treason, was ignored. The judgment was brutal, yet calculated. He would be dragged through the city on a wooden hurdle, tied down like an animal, while the crowds jeered and spat. He would be hanged until near death, his body twitching just above the ground. Then, he would be cut down, still alive. His genitals would be cut off and burned before him. His bowels would be pulled out slowly and set ablaze. His heart would be torn out of his chest, the ultimate desecration. And finally, his body would be beheaded and quartered, each limb sent to a different city in England and Scotland as a warning. This wasn't justice. It wasn't even revenge. It was a statement, loud, grotesque, unforgettable. And all of this, Wallace now knew, awaited him. Imagine what it must have felt like in that dark stone cell: no light, no hope, knowing your flesh was about to become a public message. Your death wouldn't just be witnessed. It would be distributed. And in that moment, Wallace ceased to be a man in the eyes of his captors. He was a symbol to be dismantled, piece by piece. His body began to betray him. By the time William Wallace was locked within the cold, damp confines of the Tower of London, he was already breaking, not under the force of torture, but under the weight of deliberate, drawn-out humiliation. His cell was a stone tomb. There was no warmth. No privacy. No dignity. And in that airless blackness, his mind began to suffer before the blade ever touched his flesh. We don't have Wallace's personal writings, but we can reconstruct the psychological decay based on what medieval prisoners endured, and what we know of the methodical cruelty that was coming. Sleep deprivation. Rotting food, or no food at all. Excrement left to pool in corners. The screams of others echoing through corridors. Day after day, Wallace was kept alive, not in preparation for mercy, but for maximum public suffering. His captors needed him well enough to stand, to breathe, to cry out as he was dismembered. But not so well that he could face death on his own terms. And so his body was prepared like a stage. Modern psychological studies on prisoners facing execution reveal predictable symptoms: hallucinations, anxiety spikes, muscle atrophy, and an overwhelming dread that doesn't just sit in the brain, but sinks into the bones. Wallace likely experienced all of it. But the true collapse came in knowing the exact details of his fate. He would not be killed in one place. He would be killed in stages, in pieces. First, the dragging, bound to a hurdle, pulled by a horse across the filthy, jagged roads from the Tower to Smithfield. Not only humiliating, but excruciating. His flesh would tear. His bones could dislocate. Pebbles embedded in raw skin. Then, the partial hanging, not until death, but just long enough to feel it. A choking panic. The pounding blood. The blackening of the world around him. And just as unconsciousness came near, the rope would be cut. Then came the knife. No anesthetic. No mercy. Just pain. His testicles cut off, burned before his eyes. This was not incidental, it was deliberate symbolic violence. A message: you are no longer a man. You will not breed. You will not be remembered as a father or a hero, but as a desecrated traitor. Next, his abdomen was opened, and his intestines slowly pulled out. This wasn't a single slice, it was a ritual of pain, designed to provoke horror in every spectator and reduce the human being to a screaming object. In his final moments, as his heart was removed, Wallace would likely have already lost consciousness. But even this was uncertain. In some reports, victims of disembowelment remained aware for minutes, the body's adrenaline and horror extending life past what should be survivable. And then, the final blow. The beheading, which was almost a kindness compared to what had come before. But it didn't end there. His body was hacked apart, quartered, and the pieces sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling. His head was dipped in tar and set atop a spike on London Bridge, to rot and blacken in the sun, so that everyone who crossed the Thames would see, this is what happens to those who defy England. This was not just a death. It was the unraveling of a human being, in public, with purpose. And the lesson was simple. Don't fight back. Don't become a symbol. Because if you do, we will unmake you. As Wallace suffered, the world around him moved on, or prepared to replace him. As William Wallace awaited his execution in the bowels of the Tower, Scotland did not rise. No army marched to London. No rescue plan was forged. No final letter from a comrade in arms arrived at his cell door. There was only silence. And that silence may have been the sharpest betrayal of all. Wallace had once stood as guardian of Scotland, wielding influence and commanding loyalty. But by 1305, that legacy had begun to rot beneath the surface of shifting alliances. Many of Scotland's nobles, faced with the overwhelming force of Edward I's armies, had begun to bend the knee. Some did so reluctantly. Others saw opportunity in collaboration. The resistance that Wallace had championed now seemed like a lost cause to many. Even Robert the Bruce, the man who would one day become Scotland's savior, was navigating a precarious political tightrope, flirting with both rebellion and cooperation, waiting for the right moment to strike. Wallace's execution was, for many, a calculated loss. A martyrdom that could be used, but not stopped. In the cold calculus of medieval power, a dead hero was easier to control than a living rebel. Wallace had no family at his side. His father had long since died. He had no wife, no children, at least none confirmed. If he had lovers, they were gone now. If he had friends, they were silent. The English public, whipped into nationalistic fervor, they were not mourning. They were celebrating. To them, Wallace was not a freedom fighter. He was a barbarian, a savage from the north who had led raids into English towns, left villages burning, and soldiers dead. His defiance had humiliated Edward I, and now, his death would restore the balance. To ensure maximum spectacle, Wallace's execution was scheduled to take place in Smithfield, a crowded marketplace outside the city walls. The location was no accident. It was selected for visibility, so the greatest number of people could watch a legend be unmade. As Wallace's broken body was dragged from the tower, the crowds gathered. Some came to gawk. Others came to cheer. Few, if any, came to grieve. The state needed no courtroom to convince the masses. Public display was the propaganda. And while Wallace was enduring the unthinkable, the gears of history continued to turn. English courts processed new taxes. Lords negotiated lands. In Scotland, new power players jockeyed for relevance in a post-Wallace world. Edward I, the architect of Wallace's demise, did not attend the execution. He didn't need to. His power would be felt in every slash of the knife, every scream that echoed off the stone. And once the execution ended, there was no moment of silence. There was just the cleaning of the scaffold, the disposal of remains, and the distribution of body parts to distant cities where life, politics, and power continued without pause. Wallace's heart may have burned, but no flames reached the hearts of the powerful. No monument was erected. No songs were sung. In that moment, he wasn't a man. He wasn't even a symbol yet. He was a warning, processed and shelved, and the world went back to its business. By the time death came, it was a mercy. On the 23rd of August, 1305, William Wallace was not merely sentenced to die, he was sentenced to be erased. Not with silence, but with spectacle. The morning was likely grey, London's sky heavy and indifferent. Wallace was pulled from the Tower of London, chained and half-starved, his body likely bruised, infected, emaciated. But the final act wasn't just about ending his life. It was about unmaking him, publicly, slowly, painfully. First came the dragging. Tied to a wooden hurdle, his arms and legs stretched behind him, Wallace was hauled by horse across several miles of uneven cobbled streets. His skin tore open. Dirt and stone ground into his wounds. Onlookers jeered. Children threw refuse. He was no longer a general or guardian, just a bleeding sack of flesh, rattling toward execution. Then came the gallows at Smithfield, surrounded by hundreds, perhaps thousands, of spectators. Many of them drunk, many eager to see the promised show. Wallace was hanged, but not until dead. They let him struggle, gasping and writhing, before cutting the rope and throwing him to the ground. Then, the knife. He was still alive. Before he could breathe, his genitals were cut off. Not as an afterthought, but as symbolic mutilation. A denial of masculinity, of lineage, of legacy. They were burned before his eyes. Then, his abdomen was sliced open. His intestines were slowly drawn out, loop by steaming loop, and also cast into fire. The executioner moved with ritualistic precision. This was not an amateur. It was a craftsman of agony, ensuring that Wallace stayed conscious long enough to feel his body emptying from the inside. Some accounts suggest he may have remained alive even as his heart was cut from his chest. At that moment, we must remember, Wallace wasn't screaming words of defiance. He wasn't rising in rebellion. He wasn't the firebrand of Stirling Bridge anymore. He was a naked, dismembered man in the mud. A human being, in pain. It's easy to romanticize his courage. Easier still to turn him into myth. But in that moment, there was no glory, only gore. Finally, the axe fell. His head severed, dipped in tar, and mounted on London Bridge. But his torment wasn't over. His limbs were hacked off and sent to the corners of the realm, Berwick, Newcastle, Stirling, Perth, to rot on spikes, to serve as warnings. These weren't just trophies. They were fragments of a man, scattered to the wind, so that no grave could hold him. No site could become sacred. His death was designed not to end a life, but to destroy an idea. And yet, even in that destruction, something slipped through. Not the body. Not the voice. But the memory. Because in being treated like an animal, Wallace's final moments exposed the monstrousness of the state that killed him. And in death, he ceased to be just a man. He became a mirror, one that showed the cruelty of empire, and the cost of resistance. He died without dignity. But he died as himself, unbent. And sometimes, that's all history needs to remember. The story of their death was rewritten, or buried. William Wallace's death was not meant to be remembered with reverence. It was meant to be forgotten in fear. His execution wasn't just punishment, it was performance propaganda. Every blade, every flame, every mutilation served a single purpose, to tell the world, especially Scotland, what happened to those who defied the English crown. It was a medieval press release, written in blood. But even that wasn't enough. Once Wallace's body was obliterated, the English crown turned to erasing what remained, his image, his story, his voice. He left behind no memoirs, no known letters, no official portrait. The chroniclers who recorded his death were mostly English, and their accounts were shaped by bias, politics, and the desire to demonize or diminish. The Scottish elite, for their part, had little interest in immediately immortalizing him. Many had abandoned Wallace long before his capture. Some even benefited from his absence, eliminating a rival, a complication, a reminder of their own cowardice. In the courtly records, his name often vanishes. His title as Guardian of Scotland was never officially restored. The silence was intentional. When Robert the Bruce launched his own rebellion just a year later, he made no grand proclamations about Wallace. To invoke Wallace openly would be to inherit his sentence. Instead, Wallace's legacy was quietly co-opted, his ideas repurposed, his martyrdom left unspoken. Meanwhile, English records presented Wallace not as a noble warrior, but as a traitor, a terrorist, a common outlaw. The phrase used to condemn him, a man of the greatest wickedness, was copied across royal documents. His beheading was legally justified by a single damning phrase: he raised war against his king. There would be no effort to preserve his memory, only to pervert it. His name was absent from formal education for generations. His likeness was never carved in stone. He became a ghost, whispered of in taverns and rebel songs, not history books. Centuries later, in a Scotland fighting for identity amid union with England, Wallace's legend was revived, but it was already shaped by myth, altered by agenda, softened by nationalism. The real Wallace, scarred, angry, brutal, uncompromising, was lost beneath layers of fiction. He became a romanticized freedom fighter, sanitized for patriotic consumption. Even Braveheart, the 1995 film that returned his name to global consciousness, presented a version of Wallace that never truly existed, a man of Hollywood heroism, whose execution, though horrific, was still touched by poetic defiance. The reality? There were no final words of freedom. There was no noble end. There was only pain, blood, and the machinery of state violence, followed by official silence. And so, Wallace's death became a paradox, too brutal to ignore, too dangerous to honor, too useful to tell truthfully. He was destroyed. And then, decades later, resurrected as a symbol, not of who he was, but of what others needed him to be. Wallace's life may have commanded armies, but his death speaks of something more universal: decay, memory, and the limits of power. In life, William Wallace became a threat to an empire. In death, he became an echo, twisted, distorted, retold, but never quite silenced. His death laid bare the ugliest truths of medieval justice, that power fears defiance, and will go to grotesque lengths to unmake a rebel not just physically, but spiritually. His body was quartered, his name defamed, his story suppressed. But like so many attempts at political erasure, the violence only made the memory burn hotter. Wallace's legacy is now a patchwork of contradictions: brutal warrior and folk hero, lawless raider and principled patriot, forgotten ghost and national icon. His face stares from statues, from tourist mugs, from Hollywood screens, but none of those images capture the screams in Smithfield, the tar on his severed head, or the slow horror of his disembowelment. And that's the final truth of Wallace's end: death doesn't care about glory. It comes not in cinematic slow motion, but in blood and filth. It strips away myth, title, and meaning. Yet somehow, in that total helplessness, something enduring survived. Wallace's execution failed to erase him. In fact, it accomplished the opposite. It exposed the fragile cruelty of empire, and left behind a man not of perfection, but of conviction. He died like a man devoured by the machine, but he died unchanged. Unconverted. Uncompromised. And so his death becomes a mirror, for tyrants, a warning, for the powerless, a question, for all of us, a reminder. As the philosopher Seneca once wrote, "Death is the only thing we all share. It makes equals of kings and rebels." And William Wallace, guardian of Scotland, breaker of oaths, symbol of resistance, reminds us that even the most powerful stories begin and end in the same place. The body. The flame. The silence.